Today we'll be working on lesson 4.7 inverse of radicals. So today we're going to go over radicals in general, do inverse of linear functions. Then on the back of this page we're going to be working on inverse of quadratic again, and then we can move on to inverse of radicals. So I would like to review a little bit with you before we move on directly to inverse of radicals. So let's start with the question, what does inverse mean? Now, an inverse means, what do you think? The inverse is the inverse of a function. It means you have a graph or a function where you have to switch the domain and range. You switch the domain and range. Or as I say sometimes, is that you switch the x and the y. Now, how is this graph being reflected? It's being reflected across y equals x. Now, do you remember an activity that we did earlier this year when we were introducing the inverse function? Where I divided you into groups and you did the painted hand, remember? And the hand that you drew was reflected across a line, which is the y equals x. So your hand was reflected across this line. Do you remember that? So in order to find algebraically the inverse of a function, you have to start, number one, with switching x and y, and then number two, you would find or solve for y. So with reviewing those, let's try to do those two linear functions. Now if I want to find the inverse, how would I do that? I would start first by switching the x and the y. So the y becomes x and the x becomes y. I do nothing to the signs, nothing to the numbers. Then I try to solve for y. So by doing that, I would add a 7. So I need to isolate the y. So it would be x plus 7 is equal to 3y. Then I need to find y, so I divide by 3, so y is equal to x plus 7 over 3. So that would be it. But remember we said in order to differentiate this from the other equations, we would put y to the power -1, which means that this is the inverse, is equal to x plus 7 over 3, and that would be the final function. Now let's move on to the next part. How would you find the inverse of this? Now it would be a good time for you to pause and try to do this on your own. Now you start by switching the x and the y, and then you solve for y by isolating it. Now if you have a half y, it means you have to multiply the whole thing by 2. So 2 times x would give you 2x, and then 2 times -3 would give you -6. Now this will cancel out y. So there you go. Y is equal to 2x minus 6, but again, since this is an inverse, we need to set it to the power -1. So y to the power -1 would give you 2x minus 6, indicating that this is the inverse. Now, so this is how you find the inverse of a linear function. But it would also be good to be able to do that on the calculator. So how do you do that on the calculator? First of all, you start, I'm going to do this one on the calculator. So you do y equals 3x minus 7. So y1 is equal to 3x minus 7, and then you would go to the second graph and you pick up some numbers over here up to 3 points. So let me pick up 3 points from the calculator. So I have 0, -7 and 1, -4. Let me move the cursor. So and 2, -1. So pick up to 3 points. Now remember, so these are the points of the function y equals 3x minus 7. So I'm going to write x and y on top. Now remember, when you want to find the inverse or the equation of the inverse, what you need to do is that you need to switch the x and the y. So let me rewrite those. But this time I'm going to rewrite this, and I'm going to switch the x and the y. So -7 and 0, -4 and 1, and -1 and 2. So again, you go to the calculator, you plug in y equal to the function, you get certain points and you flip those points. Now remember, this should be your L1 and this should be your L2 on the calculator. So you go to Stat and then you have to edit, enter L1 to be -7, enter, -4, enter, and -1, enter. So these are the 3 points that you chose, and then 0, enter, 1, enter, and 2, enter. Now after you switching the point, do you remember how to find the equation? You go to Stat and then you go to Calc, and then since this is a linear function, the inverse also is going to be a linear one, so you pick number 4 and you keep pressing enter until it gives you the equation. So as you can see, the equation is a.333, which is 1/3, and 2.33 again. If you want, you can do math and press enter twice. It's not going to give you that. So again, Stat, Calc, then you go to linear regression, which is number 4, and you calculate. It should give you the equation. And by the way, 0.33 is going to be this 1/3, and 2.333, it would be the 7/3. Now let's try it for this one. Again, you go to y equals. Now you would put half y or half x plus 3, and then you go to second table. You will get certain points, get 3 of those, 0, 3, now 1, 3.5, and 2, 4. Again, you go to Stat, then Edit, press enter, and now you need to enter the new points that you have. Remember, you have to switch them. So this will become the L1 and the L2, so let's switch them. You will have 3, 3.5, 4, and here you'll have 0, 1, 2, because this is how you get the inverse, by switching them. So go to Stat Calc and then you enter those in L1, so 3, 3.5. Now this is good for both the pre-AP and the regular to know, because even though the test for my pre-AP kids, you might not be allowed to use a calculator, but on the QCA you will be allowed. So this is a good way to check your work, or even do the work if you're allowed to use one. Then Stat, Calc, and then you go all the way to number 4, because the inverse of a linear is going to be a line, a linear. Press enter, and then enter. There you go. Y equals to 2x, which is this one, minus 6, which is this one. So that is the inverse. Y equals to x minus 6. Now this is a way to do it on the calculator. Now let's move on to the back page. Give some room because we don't have to use a calculator on the back part. So let's move on to the back page. Now let's look at this one. Y equals x squared minus 6. Now every time you have a quadratic function, you will not be able to use a calculator to find the inverse, because the inverse of quadratic is not going to be a quadratic, it's going to be something else. So that's why you cannot use a calculator for that. Now remember, what is the domain of a quadratic function? Do you remember, guys? It's -infinity to infinity, and the range is going to be the number over here, which is -6. And since this is something opening up, so it would be -6 up to infinity. Now if you'd like, you can graph it and double check that. Let's graph it. So we're going to use a calculator after all, just to show you how it looks. So it's going to be x squared minus 6, and then let's graph that. As you can see, it's going to be opening up, and it's going to be from this point. Now you can move the cursor to find that point. So this is going to be, as you can see, the -6, 0. It's the -6, 0, or you can go to the table to find out what this point exactly is. So it's -6, 0, so it's from -6 to infinity, and opening up, so it's -infinity to infinity. That would be the domain, and that would be the range. Now to find the inverse, let's make some room. So I'm going to write the function, which is y equals x squared minus 6. Now, first of all, you start by switching the x and the y. That's the first idea. Then you will need to isolate the y, so you add 6 to both sides. So you are left with x plus 6 is equal to y squared. I'm going to rewrite it over here. X plus 6 is equal to y squared. Now you don't need the square of y. You need the just y. So what you need to do is try to find what y is. And how can you do that? You square root both sides. Now remember, every time you square root, so square root of y squared would be just y. Remember, the square root and the square cancel each other, so you're left only with y. Remember, every time you square root, you will have the plus or minus of square root of x plus 6, so that would be the final thing. Let's rewrite it as an inverse of x plus 6. Now, that is the inverse. Now what's the nice thing about the inverse is that since this is the inverse of this function, then the domain and range over here will be the same but switched. So if the domain here is negative infinity, infinity, the range would be negative infinity, infinity. Now, if the range here is negative 6 infinity, this will be the domain, so it would be negative 6 infinity. So as you can see, to find the inverse domain and inverse range, the only thing you need to do is switch those two. Now, is the inverse a function? To be able to answer that question, let's try to graph this on the calculator. Now, so you need to graph y equals to plus or negative square root of x plus 6. Now let's go to the calculator and let's try to graph that. So if you go to y equals, now how can you enter plus or minus? You can't really. So you can only enter plus, let me clear that. You can either enter plus square root of, or basically just square root of x plus 6. And then in order for the calculator to show you everything, on y to enter negative square root of x plus 6. So negative square root of x plus 6. Okay, so as you can see, on y1 you enter the positive 1, and on y2 you enter the negative 1. Now let's graph it. Now this is how it's going to look like. Now, the question over here is the inverse a function? Is the inverse a function? Now remember, in order to tell whether it's a function or not, you have to apply something called the vertical line test. So if you apply the vertical line test over here, you'll see that it's gonna hit the graph in two parts. The line's gonna hit the graph in 2 points. And if it does that, it means that it's not a function. So no, it's not a function. If you want to sketch that and you don't have a calculator, how would you do that? Now look at the domain and range. What is the domain? The domain is negative 6. Okay, so if you want to graph that, you know that it's going to be looking something like this. So since the domain is negative 6, so it's going to be at negative 6, and it's going to be the inverse of the quadratic function, and it's going to look like this. And again, if you apply the vertical line test, it's going to cut it in 2 points. That's why it's not a function, because it does not pass the vertical line test. Now, I know this is like you might need to go back and listen to it again. So again, let's review. So if you look at the function and its inverse, what have you noticed? What is the inverse of a quadratic function? What type of function is it? It's a square root. So the inverse of a quadratic function is a square root function, as you can see. So what would be the inverse of a square root function? It would be a quadratic function. Now again, I will let you do this on your own, and we're gonna check it together in class. I think this is enough for now. So we'll do this together in class and we continue the radical one. But I'd like you to listen to this again, make sure that you understand it, and do this on your own. Now, I'll see you tomorrow, and make sure to come to class with questions.